today to talk about the pruning standards as the national ANSI standards of pruning for not only utilities but for all tree work. And all of this is applicable for trees in your yard or trees of any position because these have been written by professionals in the industry. And to incorporate that into utility pruning as it relates back to the national standards. Now what I'd like to do is I'm going to cover the different forms of pruning that are out there, that are practiced, and show you the advantages and disadvantages of both, okay? If we have any questions then, let's handle that, because there are a few points in here that are fairly complex, and I have simplified it as best I can for those that are not in the industry. To start with, let's look at the two methods that we talked about when we're discussing trimming of trees. On the left side, we have topping, which is the standard procedure. I'm going to incorporate this into it. This is a tree that's never been trimmed. Notice the nice scaffolding, what we call scaffolding of branches. If you follow out from the main trunk, you have a limb coming out. There's a lateral bud that developed and produced a limb. There's a lateral bud that developed, and each of these lateral bud limbs produced other lateral bud limbs. So you have in this tree a natural scaffolding of branches. That's what you want to see. Okay? Some, like pines, will have a very prominent top to it, and some, like maples, will not. And we call that excurrent and decurrent. We're not going to get into that. But what that essentially says is that the terminal buds up in here are well defined as to which one's going to be the dominant one. In this case, this is kind of a maple-like tree because what we've had is codominant branches. But the ends of every one of these little limbs is a terminal bud. That's how this tree is going to grow. Now, what we're going to do is there's a power line up here. This could work for a garage, overhang, anything we want to use it for. There's an obstruction. We don't want this tree to grow into that obstruction, so what we're going to do is we're going in and top it. Okay? We're going to ignore the fact that it has terminal buds. We're going to ignore the fact that how it grows. We're going to go in there and take the height out of this tree the best we know how, and that's it. Where's the problem with that? Well, notice where we made these cuts, there's no terminal buds on any of these. The bud's been taken off. All of a sudden, these limbs are going to die if they do not grow in length. That's just the natural process that's incorporated in this tree. So, this tree is going to go into a stress mode, and it's going to try to produce some growth from this area that was pruned or trimmed any way it can. If it's an evergreen, it's going to produce growth from these sides. If it's a hardwood, those dormant buds that I told you about are going to become activated. Now, if this is a utility and we top this tree, we've got clearance, but very quickly we lose clearance. And the reason is because the tree is under a tremendous amount of stress without terminal buds in there. And so what the tree is going to do is going to produce water sprouts. First it produces the sprouts, then it produces the leaves. Now it can manufacture photosynthesis. Through the process of photosynthesis, it can manufacture food. Okay? No leaves, no food. If it doesn't have leaves, it doesn't eat. We took all the leaves out right in this whole area. So this tree is much of Tennessee. Many states has been outlawed. Essentially, they have learned the difference, and so they have now gone to the pruning method. But the topping method is the one that you will see practiced on private individual yards and practiced in many areas. And it's essentially defined as excessive and arbitrarily removal of all parts of the tree, without regard for the growth of the tree. Okay, so we don't have to know anything about how a tree grows in order to go topping. On the other hand, if we're talking about pruning, which is following the national standards, we do know a little bit about the growth pattern of a tree, and we're going to use selective removal. So we're only going to take the branches that we need to. Why? Because the more leaf foliage that tree has, the more food it manufactures for itself. Okay? We can fertilize the tree, and you will hear foresters sometimes work worse than doctors. You know, a doctor will tell you, take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. Foresters will say, fertilize your tree, call me next year. Because fertilizers are nutrients that we put in the soil. We cannot feed a tree. Okay? The tree has to feed itself through the process of photosynthesis. Alright, so we're going to focus in on this. This is a picture of a normal limb, that grows. And there's a couple points that I want to bring out. Right here at the very end of every limb is called a terminal bud. This bud has one function and one function only. And that is to elongate in the spring and continue the length of this limb. If we're talking about the top of a tree, same difference. So the end of every limb has a terminal bud. The hormones, the growth hormones, come up in the spring and they initiate right here and they stimulate that bud to grow. Okay? So it will grow in length. Now, last year that bud cut off right there. And so it's not rocket science. Sometimes people think it is. When we come out and look at a tree in the wintertime and we go, your tree wasn't doing very good last year, was it? And they go, gee, how'd you know? Well, what we're looking at is the growth, the difference between here and here. Because that's how far the tree is going to grow in a year's time. Okay? That's the terminal bud scar from last year. Then it broke loose and it grew to this year. Then it cut off. And this is going to be the next year's growth. Everybody with me on that? It is absolutely crucial that we understand that that tree really needs that terminal bud intact and healthy. Okay? We're going to define a pruning method based on that knowledge of how a tree grows. Topping does not. Topping will come in here and anywhere we want. Let's say we want to cut a foot out of it and we just cut across it. It's called stub cutting. Okay? Now that limb no longer has a terminal bud if it's cut off right there because we took that terminal bud off. There are some strange things that's going to happen in that tree when that terminal bud is lost. And this could be happening in an ice storm, it could be happening in a hailstorm, it could be happening naturally. The other thing I want to bring out is right here is called a lateral bud. And this has a terminal bud in it. Now, the reason that this does not grow as fast as that one does is because this is what we call apical dominance, and that is that this tree is designed to grow that way. The only reason that this would have any more energy than that bud right there is if this bud is killed. Now, if we're talking about a conifer, then what will happen is if we trim this anywhere in here and cut off this terminal bud, this whole limb, you've seen them, conifers, this lateral branch will become what we might call the terminal, and it will be the top. And it will curve around and try to capture what this used to. Okay? That's on a conifer. It happens to spruces, pines, firs, etc. Later in evolutionary stage in this planet, we ended up with hardwoods. Hardwoods have underneath the bark what's called dormant buds, and that's not the picture of them. These are lenticels, which are openings that exchange gases from the inside. But underneath the bark are what we call dormant buds. Okay? Now, in the evolutionary process, the conifer is real hard to grow this back up and replace all of this growth that's been cut off already. But with dormant buds in a hardwood tree, what happens is if that terminal bud is lost, those dormant buds will become activated by the growth hormones, and you'll have water sprouts coming out of the end of the limb. And each one of those water sprouts has on the end of it a terminal bud. So the loss of this terminal bud indicates to this whole entire tree what's going to happen. Now, I know I've been here a little while. We're going to move on.